Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss essential topics about the art and culture of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the show. I've decided on doing a bit of an impromptu early recording that's admittedly coming with less preparation in light of a federal holiday that we just celebrated, some of us just celebrated, in the United States, Columbus Day. Now, this, I suppose, prompted me to kind of do an off-script sort of presentation to you guys about Christopher Columbus. For those of you in the United States, you probably know the debate pretty well, and for those of you who are not, I will summarize it for you. There is essentially a move away from celebrating Christopher Columbus, and if you guys follow my Instagram, you probably saw a post about that was controversial and got a little bit of flack, to which I didn't really respond to, because it got some praise too, and I just wanted to use this episode as a platform to propose how we should be reading the history of Christopher Columbus as a figure of the Italian Renaissance. Let's not think that this is not relevant to our show, because it is. We have to keep in mind that Columbus is operating within what is referred to as the Age of Exploration, which coincides with the end of the Quattrocento, okay? And, of course, Christopher Columbus was an Italian by the means in which we identify Italians in that period as belonging to the Italian peninsula, but not adhering to what can be considered as an Italian state, which is kind of part of the issue at hand here. I do this knowing it's going to upset some people, and that's not my intention. My job is to teach you the history of the Italian Renaissance, and the history in this case is the settled history of Christopher Columbus. That has nothing to do with national sentiment. It has nothing to do with your perception of heritage, and it has nothing to do with how change makes you feel uncomfortable, if that is the case for Columbus that's being made. And I am going to go over the opposition here and why I think it's inadequate. So let me make my stance clear. Let me make it perfectly clear. Christopher Columbus was a monster. He operated within a time period where monstrosity was more common, but not acceptable still. Okay, in that we do not praise tyrants, we do not praise slavers, we do not praise the genocidal. That is not how history is relaying Christopher Columbus. Okay, but what about his fantastic navigational skills? What about his daring exploration? We're going to talk about that. My argument is ultimately that it is just by circumstance that Columbus happened to be in the American continents, and that is it. That's basically the breadth of it, and it came at the cost of indigenous life. I want to be very transparent about where I'm getting my information from. Previously, I was an instructor of Italian language at The Ohio State University in the Department of French and Italian. And they ultimately composed a very brilliant demonstration with some pretty good sources. And this is coming from the mouths of professors trained in the field, translated to me, and then I took this presentation and I added some additional information from my own background because, as you guys probably know, Columbian exploration is not my strongest suit in Renaissance studies, but I'm generally educated in this period enough to speak with some sort of authority to you guys to understand what was happening and why we're looking at Columbus as more tyrannical and villainous now than heroic and fantastic. So that said, I am going right off of an edited presentation PowerPoint that I'm referencing visually to guide this conversation with you guys, okay? So coming from the Ohio State University, you guys probably know, and if you don't, it's located in Columbus, Ohio. So this conversation is really strong here because, it's named after the man, just like, a million other places. However, that's part of the problem. And a lot of places named after Columbus have these monuments erected to his honor. And if we're going with he is a man that should not be honored, celebrated, or given a holiday to, that causes a problem. And we're going to get to that kind of artistic representation in terms of community and what that means, right? So I'm coming from this in a background of kind of Columbus in the sphere of social conscience. Does that make sense? So just a little bio on him. He was born in Genoa. Keep that in mind, Genoa or Genova in Italian, because we're going to come back to Genoa in 1451, kind of in the northern corner of what we are calling Italy, right? And this has at times been taken by Italian Americans as a representative symbol of their sense of identity, that America was discovered by an Italian. And if you guys recall, it's actually named after Amerigo Vespucci, who we covered in the Simonetta Vespucci episode, if you want to know more on that. So keep in mind again, Italy did not exist at the time. It didn't become a nation until 1861. Does that make sense? And we're talking the 1450s when he was born, the 1490s when he starts his voyages, which coincides with the Primavera that we looked at from the 1480s, right? I want to say this again. The story is settled, okay? We're looking at a historical individual with plenty of historical evidence to make the claims we're making. We're talking about someone who was ultimately wrong navigationally, reckless in his application of kind of pseudo-rule, and quite monstrous in how he deployed that rule. And I know this creates complicated feelings within a lot of us. And what I'm asking us to do is to try to be objective. And I say this all the time. When you listen to history, it's my interpretation of history. History as you've been given it is someone else's interpretation of history, namely coming out of a nationalistic, heritage-based background. So what we have to do is reinterpret history to try to be as neutral and as correct as possible. Okay? That is why history is continually being reinterpreted today. Because new perspectives, new concepts, right? And of course, we're letting more voices in. History isn't being written specifically from upper class white guys anymore. We need to understand history as plural and diverse. So when we think of Christopher Columbus, there's a specific word that comes to mind, and it's typically discovery. So if we want to muddy up that question, what does it mean if you discover something that already has inhabitants? Okay, and then we see the verbiage kind of shifting. He discovered it for the West, or he discovered it for Europe, or what have you. But realistically, we're not talking about a man who found something intentionally, who knew what he found, or even a man who used proper navigational technique to arrive where he came to. Okay? What I mean is that to discover implies that something is lost. Well, realistically, the only thing lost was Christopher Columbus. We often hear that Columbus had a passion for discovery, for unasked questions. No, not really. What we're talking about is a massive error, right? The question at hand was already answered correctly nearly 2 millennia before Columbus set sail. What we're talking about is setting out across the ocean from Europe and thinking he was going to find Asia. And what that requires is, now we have to keep in mind, mathematics was highly advanced in the Quattrocento, okay? Highly advanced. So there were already relatively accurate measurements of the circumference of the Earth, right? We're talking Greek scholarship, Eratosthenes, I don't know how to say his name, in the 3rd century BCE, right? 1800 years before Columbus. But here's the situation. This was debated. What's the circumference, right? We haven't gone from Europe into towards the American continents yet, as far as the Italian peninsula is concerned. But there was a mathematician, very important one, by the name of Paolo Toscanelli, right? He's a Quattrocento mathematician and astronomer. He's one of these early Florentine humanists. We talk about that a lot, Florentine humanism. Toscanelli was one of them. He was just more in the mathematics side, which I do not particularly talk about too much. But he had his own concept about the circumference of the globe. But so did Columbus. So Toscanelli's miscalculation, which Columbus adhered to Toscanelli's calculation of the Earth's circumference, right? So the scholarly consensus in Columbus' day was that the globe's circumference was roughly 40,000 kilometers. But Columbus preferred to believe Toscanelli's miscalculations that it was only 25,000 kilometers. We're talking a 15,000 kilometer difference, right? A continent, a hemisphere. So this great navigator wasn't so great. He's sailing for the Spanish Empire. He's Italian, but he sails for Spain. He starts his first voyage, one of 4, in the 1490s. And he leaves Europe with the wrong measurements for the globe. And so when he arrives in what he thinks is Asia, what he ultimately starts to refer to as parts of Japan, what he starts to refuse to speak of as a new space, does not recognize that he's in a new continent, which is why, again, it's the name is given to Amerigo, who actually writes that on the map. Are we understanding what I'm saying here? This isn't a great navigator. This isn't an unparalleled, fantastic explorer who discovered America. That's not the case. And that is just what the history says, okay? So keep that in mind. He's following the Toscanelli model, which is wrong. He's following his own calculations, which are wrong. He arrives where he does it, in a place where he thinks is somewhere else because of his miscalculations. Even though the information was already there in his period, he went against the consensus and ultimately did not go where he thought he was going, right? He just happened upon it based on his own errors. So Winona LaDuke, right, who's an Ojibwe writer and an environmentalist, he writes something about Columbus here. He says, "But unfortunately, he did not discover himself in the process of his lostness. He went on to destroy peoples, land, and ecosystems in his search for material wealth and riches. Columbus was a perpetrator of genocide, responsible for setting in motion the most horrendous holocaust to have occurred in the history of the world. Columbus was a slave trader, a thief, a pirate, and most certainly not a hero. To celebrate Columbus is to congratulate the process and history of the invasion." A hot take. I want to continue this talk looking to the notion of discovery You hear it all the time that, oh, okay, Leif Erikson and the Vikings had discovered the American continent before. That's true, all right? But they're not the only ones to have known about the continent. I'm on a website, mymodernmet.com, and the title of this article is Scholar Discovers a 14th Century Monk Wrote About the Americas Before Columbus' Discovery. I'm going to read some of this for you. The first Europeans to set foot on American shores are believed to be Norse sailors, Vikings, in the 10th century. Norsemen explored and settled parts of the Canadian coastline and remained there for hundreds of years. Despite this Scandinavian knowledge of lands to the west, scholars believe southern Europe remained largely in the dark until the voyages of Columbus. A recent discovery of mention to Markland, likely Labrador or Newfoundland, in the 14th century Italian text suggests that one monk at least knew of the continent's existence. The discovery was made by Paolo Chiesa, professor of medieval Latin literature at Milan University and his graduate student. Chiesa had tracked down the one existing copy of a manuscript known as the Chronica Universalis. The book's history is complicated. Originally held by the Basilica of San Ambrogio in Milan, the document was removed from the collection when it was liquidated after Napoleon's conquest. Somehow, it found its way to New York. The book was written by a medieval Dominican named Galvano Fiamma. The private collector let Chiesa photograph the book for research. While translating the pages from Latin, a graduate student named Giulia Greco noticed an interesting passage which followed mention of Iceland and Greenland. The text read, and this is of course a translation from Latin into English, "Farther westward there is another land named Marcalada where giants live. In this land there are buildings with huge slabs of stone that nobody could build them except huge giants. There are also giant trees, animals, and a great quantity of birds." So the scholar Chiesa, he calls this passage astonishing. It is evidence that this one monk was, at the very least, aware of the existence of North America long before Columbus set sail. The monk explains that he received his knowledge from sailors who frequent the seas of Denmark and Norway, who must have passed along the tales to the seamen at the port of Genoa. Fiamma likely studied in the seaport, which may have put him in contact with the sources of this knowledge. This fascinating sentence raises several questions. How widespread was knowledge of Markland? Why do no Italian maps of the period show what we now call North America? And lastly, since Columbus was from Genoa, did he have an inkling of what lay to the west? The answer is no, right? While these questions are present mysteries, future research may shed light on what medieval Southern Europeans knew about America. That's the end of the quote there. So what I'm saying about this, guys, is that not only in the 10th century was the American hemisphere that we call today America already known. You can actually, if you read Northeast indigenous folklore, compare it to Norse legend, you'll see an astonishing amount of similarities. But also in Genoa, where Columbus was born, where his father was from, he was a Genovese merchant, right? Which means he should have been roughly familiar with the sea life, the port life, the trade life. In the 13th century, they knew about Markland. This is the question. How many people knew about that? And of course, he has some weird mythologized version of it. It's full of giants and this sort of thing. If we're saying Columbus discovered America, even though other people had already been there, other people were already writing about it, in what capacity are we saying he discovered it? Because he accidentally arrived there based on his own incompetence? This is the history. Okay? So let's check excellent navigator and discoverer off the box. Okay? Let's move on from that. He kept diaries, of course, of what he witnessed, what he experienced. And I've read accounts where he talks about very amicable relationships with the indigenous people he encountered, and I'm sure that happened. What we're talking about is a mixed relationship that resulted in a lot of death. Okay. I'm going to quote from his diary here. He says, "These natives would be excellent slaves. With just 50 men, we could subjugate them all and use them however we see fit." So he says that, and he may also say, "Oh, we will make excellent relationship with the natives, and we'll, they are welcoming, etc., etc." Does it matter if he's also saying, "Let's enslave them"? How easy would that be? There's also accounts of how he describes with relish how his men would compete to kill more indigenous peoples, and in more inhumane ways than their companions, right? Competitions for gruesome murder. It's really, really excellent stuff here, guys. So, what this comes down to is that Columbus Day is bred out of a concept of Italian-American heritage, which belongs to a period where Italian-Americans were, if you guys don't know your history of Italian migration, we can liken it to kind of what's going on with Mexican migrants today. Really awful political moves against migration or immigration. And it was before everyone loved Italian stuff. Italians were the dirty worker migrants here to steal your jobs and commit crime and smuggle drugs, all the horrible things that you hear over and over. It's just a broken record on repeat that I'm tired of hearing, frankly. But that got translated into an admiration for finding, but the discoverer of America is Italian, and therefore renewing some kind of pride in a place where you're being treated poorly. I get it. I'm going to, however, come into this quote from the founder of the Italian-American Heritage Society of Chicago, Gabriel Piemonte. He says, "The truth of Columbus is a naked will to power, a bloodthirstiness so extreme in its fervor that it got him swiftly sent back to Spain after his arrival to be tried for his savagery. Columbus' reign in Hispaniola ended with him in chains, dragged home to answer for his infamous crimes against the people, word of which had reached the court of Spain and caused alarm. In an age of barbarity, he stood out. This is the now hidden Columbus, the truth about his bottomless ambition and heartless cruelty. He was an outrage even to the sensibilities of 15th century monarchs." That means monarchs who were also engaging in inquisition. Because Columbus found that it was his sole intention to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. So he was really more of a missionary than a navigator. And realistically, when we're talking about contemporary American heritage, it is found on the back of religious freedom, not subjugation. And on that note, I do want to clarify. So what Piemonte is saying here is that is a fact that he was removed from and called back to Spain in chains. He was imprisoned. He was tried. He was ultimately acquitted. And I hear this from those who want to continue to honor this man. "Oh, he wasn't guilty." That's not true. Acquittal does not mean innocent. Okay? Let's keep that in mind. Let's keep this in mind in the wealthy powerhouse of the courts of the Spanish Empire that want to maintain their investments that honestly had no problem killing innocents themselves. And we're talking about acquittal, not innocence. It is not the same thing. A lot of times what this comes down to is the ugly discussion of the removal of monuments, the removal of statues. As someone who's lived in Columbus for a long time, as someone who studied in the Deep South and has strongly advocated for the removal of Confederate monuments, I just want to say my piece on that is that I'm not interested in the destruction of monuments. I think that has happened too much in our history, and that these need to serve as relics to an outdated system of nationalistic, patriotic malarkey that honors brutality, Okay, I think we need to be constantly reminded of that. So I don't think these should be destroyed. Do I think that someone like Columbus should have a statue in a prominent square? No, it can go into a museum. So there's a Columbus poet who, by the name of Hanif Abdurraqib, who says a city cannot consistently transform itself at the expense of its most marginalized citizens and not expect those citizens to have a vast imagination about what a further transformation, whether of statues, names, or leadership, could be. And then from the opposition, Angelo Vivolo, president of the Columbus Heritage Association, he says, the willful defilement of Columbus statues around the country are an act of hate against more than 17 million Italian Americans. What I'm arguing for is that is not the case, in that there is more than enough actually noteworthy Italians that Italian Americans can draw heritage inspiration from, or what have you, whatever people look for in heritage, okay? While we can sympathize with early Italian immigrants who turned to Columbus as a symbolic beacon as they confronted waves of prejudice in America, we can look to legions of other far more positive individuals to whom Italian Americans could now turn to feel tethered to the richness and diversity of the many cultures that have flourished on the Italian peninsula over the centuries, right? And we're already doing this work, right? Coming from the perspective of an Italian American who works in this field. One last article I kind of want to dive into is from the Daily Citizen, and it says, the left hates Christopher Columbus. Here are 5 reasons why we should still celebrate Columbus Day. And among those reasons, we've already covered them, right? Columbus, number 1, is Columbus personified the American spirit in how he wasn't, there was nothing American about him. He even denied the existence of the continent. They're talking about the age of exploration and the drive west and all this sort of thing. It's malarkey. Columbus undertook adventure for God and country, right? Yes, we said this. He's a missionary. We're secular. We are not meant to elevate the status of forceful subjugation of religious practices. In fact, the foundation of the United States, which has nothing to do with Columbus. Let's be frank about that. We're talking about the American continents here, not the sovereign nation of the United States. It has nothing to do with Columbus's obsession with Christian conversion, the wealth he was getting from the Spanish Empire. It was a money move. It was a personal faith move. It's not, we should not be celebrating God and country. This does not express individual freedom the way the United States is meant to. And it says, it's point 3, if Columbus is off limits to celebrate, so are indigenous peoples, citing that they also committed slavery and genocide against each other. But what we're talking about is a colonial imperial power with more advanced technology suppressing a group of people. Okay. If we don't want to celebrate indigenous people in terms of which, have no holidays on the land that they are entitled to, that was forcibly taken from them at the cost of their population, then we can at least use it as a day of remembrance for those who were slaughtered under the Columbus regime, enslaved or worse. It says, point 4, that Columbus is innocent of most of the charges against him. We already covered that. He wasn't innocent. He was acquitted. It's not the same thing. He wrote about his atrocities. He was tried for his atrocities. He was in prison for his atrocities. And there's more than enough blood to speak to his atrocities. Okay? And then it says that historical figures should be viewed in light of their greatest achievements, not their worst mistakes. How absurd. Okay, how absurd. What did Hitler do that we should be viewing him in light of his great achievement and just ignore all of the genocide that happened under him, right? It's an absurd concept. Especially not their worst mistakes. Everything Columbus did was a mistake. We're not talking about an intentional, brilliant navigator who made some major discovery, who sailed across the world to land on a continent that he was looking for. We're just talking about a bunch of errors that culminated in genocide, and it does not I don't even know how to, such a stupid claim. Historical figures should be viewed in light of their greatest achievements, not their worst mistakes. What nonsense. I don't even know who wrote this? Zachary Mettler. He looks like a goob too. I don't know how to refute something so idiotic, frankly, guys. And I'm not trying to sound aggressive. Like I said, the history is settled. Okay. I want to end this episode knowing that this is not going to sit well with all of you. I want to end this episode knowing that what I'm saying can be viewed as controversial. But I also want to end it in saying that I tried to approach this from objectivity. I don't come from an indigenous background. Obviously, I'm sure if you've listened to my show, I've got some left-leaning concepts, but I view the world not from a binary like a lot of my fellow Americans do. So I think that I've presented to you the history, my interpretation of the history, and why I think it's important to stop elevating tyrants. That is my mission to the world in light of history, in light of Italy, in light of contemporary politics. Stop elevating tyrants. And with that, let's look to a better future that is not bathed in toxic patriotism, nationalism. And I know that I say I'm trying to do this through object history. However, I know this also carries an important message that has to be said. This is on the back of specialists in Italian heritage. This is on the back of researchers of Italian studies. And I want it to be clear that if you think this message is important, not just fun, let's talk about art, not just fun, let's hear how Giuliano de' Medici got killed, which is horrible, but something important to be heard, important to be said, share this. Let people know about this message because I think it's important, not from a political perspective, but from a perspective of how we need to be engaging history. Okay? Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, arrivederci.